There we go.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining AIA New Jersey Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee for tonight's presentation on racism and its impact on the American city, Trenton as a case study. I'd like to welcome and thank our speaker tonight, John Hatch, a fellow of AIA. John is an architect and principal with Clark Caton Hints, an architecture planning and landscape architecture firm located in Trenton, New Jersey. In his more than 30 years with CCH, John has managed the design and construction of a wide array of architecturally significant buildings. These include George Pruitt Hall at Thomas Edison State University, the New School of Business at NJCU, the restoration of Monvin, the former governor's mansion in Princeton, and multiple phases of the Roebling Complex redevelopment in Trenton. His work includes new and renovated facilities for colleges and universities, as well as public and independent schools, multi-unit and senior housing projects, historic and urban revitalization projects, and significant commercial and civil projects. All of his projects address issues of context, civic life, and sustainability. In addition to his design work, John has written and lectured about such topics as historic preservation, sustainability, and urban redevelopment. John is a 32-year resident of the city of Trenton and sits on the Trenton Landmarks Commission, as well as the boards of the Princeton Area Community Foundation, Passage Theater, the New Jersey Capitol Philharmonic, and the Trenton Historical Society. He is also a principal with HX2 Development, which is the developer of Roebling Lofts and Roebling Center in Trenton. John, thank you very much, and you may begin your presentation. John, you might be muted. John, are you able to hear me? Please check if you're muted because we're not able to hear you, John.
Got it.
Thank you. Now I can hear you.
Great. Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Stacy and Lisa. I very much appreciate it. So tonight I'm going to talk about racism and its impact on the American city. And as a 32-year resident of Trenton, I'm going to use Trenton as a case study. But I want to be very clear that I could have used any number of cities across New Jersey. I could have used virtually any city in the United States as a case study. But because I've lived in Trenton so long, I really became aware of the issues here. See if I can do it. There we go. So as Stacy said, I'm a principal with Clark Caton Hints and with HX2 Development. A little bit more about my background. I'm originally from Brooklyn, and then my family moved to Long Island in 1972. So you could say that we were part of white flight. I am a 32-year resident of the city of Trenton. I moved here right out of graduate school and thinking that I'd stay in Trenton for a year or two, and I've ended up being here for more than 32 years. And I have loved the experience. I live here because it just has been a great place to live and to work. Just extraordinary people and great resources. And I've learned a lot about what's happened to the American city. So I'm going to start so this presentation was developed as I pondered over three questions as I lived in Trenton. The first is, why did American cities universally experience decline starting around the 1950s? Why are our cities so segregated? Why are they so racially, so ethnically, and especially so economically segregated? Why is so this is a little bit harsh, but why is our built environment, why is the American built environment so ugly and so environmentally unsustainable? And as somebody who loves historic preservation and historic buildings, why is historic preservation in this country so difficult? And historic preservation in the sense of redevelopment, redeveloping historic properties. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about racism, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. What most people think of as racism is conscious and purposeful racist acts. So people who do and say obviously racist and prejudiced things and do awful things. What I think we are coming to grips with as a country and as white people is that there's also unconscious and unthinking racism. So that's implicit bias. So we don't think that we are prejudiced, but kind of, our actions kind of belie some implicit bias. The third, and this is what I'm really, really interested in this evening, is systemic, structural, institutional racism. So that is kind of how we are set up. And, in the United States, I think that's also becoming clearer, that we are also, the system is structurally racist. So slightly different way to think about this is that there is prejudice, and these are personal attitudes. They're either overt, covert, or unconscious. There's also discrimination, which is actions that are based on that prejudice, and that can be personal discrimination and it can be institutional discrimination. And then there is what I'm talking about tonight, systemic institutionalization of prejudice and discrimination. A couple more ideas to keep in mind about racism. It is an invention. The racism as a system was invented. It was invented to justify an economic system that benefited a very small minority of white people, generally in the South. There's nothing necessary about it. It took advantage of sort of humans' natural tendency to have prejudice, and prejudice in some context is actually very useful. So if you are dealing with mushrooms, it's good to be prejudiced about certain mushrooms so you don't eat poisonous ones. But prejudice is very unuseful in dealing with people. But we have a natural tendency as humans to categorize and to have prejudices. So racism was a system that took advantage of that characteristic of humans. Racism has obviously, and it's become more and more obvious, what an unmitigated disaster it has been for Black people for over 400 years in this country. But the point that I want to make tonight is that it's also an unmitigated disaster for American society as a whole. Now, a couple ideas to keep in mind about American cities, actually about cities in general. Development patterns that result in the built environment around us are a perfect reflection and embodiment of a society's predominant cultural beliefs, attitudes, implicit bias, and policies. And by perfect, I mean there is a necessary correlation. What you see around you is a necessary correlation of our predominant cultural beliefs, attitudes, implicit bias, and policies. And because America is a structurally racist society, our development patterns reflect that structural racism. A couple more ideas. When a society or a culture is systemically racist, just living your life, just living your white life leads to racist outcomes. And by this, I mean, I remember growing up, it just felt perfectly natural that we would move from the city to Long Island, to quote the country, to the suburbs. And it seemed like that was the right thing to do. It was the path of least resistance. What I'm hoping to show tonight is that those actions, which felt perfectly normal, not racist. For us, they weren't based, we didn't think they were based on prejudice or racism, were the result of a structurally racist society that pushed or encouraged or made that the path of least resistance. And to solve racism, empathy is not enough. You know, most of us have lots of empathy now for what's going on with the murders of George Floyd and many others that we've seen so much in the media, but it's not enough. And it's not up to Black people to cure white racism. It is impossible for Black people to cure a structurally racist society. And it's like, as Venus Williams said, it's like asking Black people to solve racism. It's like asking women to solve sexism. Black people are not the problem. The structurally racist society is the problem. And if you are the victim of it, how can you solve it? So now to Trenton as a case study. Trenton, located on the falls of the Delaware. I'm going to give you a little bit of a historic background. The site was visited for hundreds, actually thousands of years by Native Americans, and was settled by white people in 1679. It was the site of the first two victories in the American Revolution, briefly was capital of the United States. Its major growth, like many cities in New Jersey and on the East Coast, began in the 1830s. And in Trenton, that's because of the Delaware and Raritan Canal, and then the construction of two railroads. Major industries included steel, rubber, wire rope. Trenton is probably most famous for wire rope, ceramics. The peak population of Trenton was something over 130,000 people. It's a small, dense city, 7.1 square miles. And that was between 1925 and 1950. It kind of fluctuated around 130,000. Today, the population is about 85,000. I think that's an undercount, but about 85,000 people. And that is a 37% decline, which is pretty middle of the road for the population decline that American cities experience. Now, there's some, like New York, that experience very little, and it's actually grown since then, since the 1980s. But it experienced many of the other things that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So here is a 1745 map of Trenton on the Delaware. This is the William Trent House. William Trent built his house in 1719 as his country estate, and then laid out the streets of downtown Trenton. This was Trenton, obviously a recreation during the First Battle of Trenton. Just a couple of hundred families lived in the city, very small. Even though it was so small, it was one of the largest towns in New Jersey. Even by 1798, you can still see how bucolic the city was. This is the Trent House in the foreground, and I think that this is the State House, but really it was large estates along the Delaware River, and then a small, dense downtown. So here is when the action really started to happen. This is 1836, and the construction of the Delaware and Raritan Canal, connecting up to New Brunswick, down to Bordentown, and the Delaware and Raritan Canal feeder that connects to Lambertville. Here's a little shout out to my historic district neighborhood, Mill Hill, right there, right in downtown Trenton. And now in 1849, you can see how much it is growing. More streets are laid out. 1874, dramatic growth, and you can start to see factories, major factories that have been built. This is the Roebling Wire Works over here. Actually, all of this over here. You can see the canals and the railroads that have started to come through the city. The most famous industry in Trenton is wire rope, the John A. Roebling Sons Company, a highly innovative company that developed technology so that you could spin very long, very large wire rope, up to 4 miles long. And virtually every major suspension bridge in the United States has its start here at these plants in Trenton. The Brooklyn Bridge, the Manhattan Bridge, the Verrazano Bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge. But the largest industry in Trenton was pottery, ceramics, and sanitary ware for many years, Trenton was the largest producer of pottery and ceramics in the United States. So American Standard got its start here in Trenton, Lenox, China. A major producer of steel. This is the US Steel plant in the 1920s, right on the Delaware River. And this is where Waterfront Park, the baseball stadium, is now located. And this is the railroad bridge over the Delaware River. And that's what's now known as the Trenton Makes Bridge. Trenton grew and tracked a lot of the other urban developments happening across the country. The City Beautiful movement has some wonderful examples here in the city in Trenton. This is the Trenton City Hall, built in 1907, the typical kind of classical revival, bringing that grandeur into cities. Stacy Park, the big downtown park, used to be right behind the State House, between the State House and the Delaware River to your right. So this is Trenton kind of at its urban peak. This is an aerial view of 1924. Just off to the left is the Delaware River. Kind of off to the left and top is where the State House is. I live off to the right over here. But you can see very dense, very walkable, churches, stores, small factories, apartments, houses, civic buildings, all mixed together, all connected by a dense street grid and by a very well-developed public transportation system, trains and trolleys. So this is Trenton in early 1930s, the very typical of downtown, small downtown cities in the United States. Eclectic, wonderful architecture, movie theaters. You can see the trolley lines, lots of shops, either with storage up above or apartments, different age of buildings, very, very eclectic and wonderful architecture. And this is the exact kind of architecture that you see in Trenton, that this eclectic architecture and walkable cities, what Americans before COVID used to spend a lot of money traveling to Europe for. And so this is another view of downtown Trenton in the early 1930s. Oh, my apologies. This is London in the 1930s, Notting Hill Gate. So very similar. And it's exactly, we had in the United States, this kind of eclectic architecture with the trolleys, that same kind of quality. This is Trenton in the 1950s. The system has been dismantled. You can see the public bus system, but still it has that same character. So this is Trenton in 1931 at its peak. And you can see how densely developed it is. It's got train lines coming through it. Here, sorry. This is the Delaware and Raritan Canal coming through, right, dense development right up to the river, except for the wonderful Stacy Park right behind the State House. Mixed into these neighborhoods, this is the Rolling Wire Rope Works here, 40 acres of factories very close to downtown. So dense development, exactly what we visit Europe to see. So population at its peak, a little over 130,000. The Great Depression hits right around then. And the Great Migration, which had started around 1900, which was the largest internal migration, and certainly in the United States and one of the largest in the world, where African Americans escaped the Jim Crow South looking for jobs and opportunities in the northern industrial cities. And so what happened is a big influx of new residents into northern cities, and it changed demographics in the cities and brought to the fore what had been latent racism in northern cities. So there was a backlash, there were riots instigated by white residents, and a lot of reaction to this Great Migration. So now here is Trenton in 1941. And by this time, the United States is gearing up, the industry is gearing up for World War II, so industry is still booming. A number of policies and laws had been passed during the New Deal in an attempt to counteract the Great Depression. So one of the things that was passed was the Works Progress Administration, which funded a lot of major infrastructure projects around the United States. And in Trenton, it filled in the Delaware and Raritan Canal. And perhaps most famously, in 1933, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was created, and the National Housing Act was passed in 1934. And these had the laudable goals of restarting the American residential industry, to encourage and help finance the purchase of single-family homes, which had really tanked in the Depression. So for the first time, the federal government, to assist this residential mortgage industry, insured residential mortgages. Now, part of this law, the National Housing Act, they created a federal home loan bank, and this insurance process then included what came to be known as redlining. The Federal Home Loan Bank created residential security maps that rank neighborhoods by what a good bet they were for insurance. So if they were green, they were wealthy, they might be open space, they were new, they were white. If they were red, then the next level was blue, then yellow, and then red. If a neighborhood was poor, Black, ethnic, immigrants, and if it was older housing stock, it was redlined, and it was virtually impossible to get a mortgage in those neighborhoods, both in red and even in yellow neighborhoods. So here in Trenton, you can see the impact of the Works Progress Administration. The Delaware and Raritan Canal is filled in. And major significant parts of downtown Trenton were redlined. So starting in the 1930s, it was virtually impossible to get a residential mortgage in many neighborhoods in Trenton. So here is the security map that was developed for Trenton. And you can see big swaths of downtown Trenton are redlined. That's fourth grade. And then the bulk of the city was yellow. So redlined areas, impossible to get mortgages, yellow, very difficult. And only a small portion of the city, what's called the West Ward now, the newest part of the city, was green, and you could get pretty readily a mortgage in those parts. So this is Stacy Park in the 1920s. And by the 1940s, later in the 1940s, you can see the impact of other infrastructure that's financed by the federal government, the development of highways, and also the encouragement of the automobile culture. So a big chunk of Stacy Park has been turned into surface parking, as well as other parts of downtown Trenton. So now in 1958, so this is the Delaware and Raritan Canal that's been filled in. There's continued redlining, and in 1944, the GI Bill is passed, which again, nominally a laudable goal. It's to help returning GIs get residential mortgages. The problem is that it uses the same insurance that has already been developed by the Federal Home Loan Bank and uses redlining. And so the effect is to subsidize the construction of white suburbs. So, and then in 1956, the interstate highway system is passed and funded. So, and then because the impact of these anti-urban policies are starting to be felt, new laws are passed creating urban renewal, which allows cities and municipalities to demolish poor, and redlined neighborhoods in preparation for new development, quote, in preparation for new development. And the only thing that could pretty much get funded in urban areas is public housing. So all the folks that are then getting dislocated by urban renewal, getting pushed out of their neighborhoods, then the Black and brown people are then forced into public housing, in effect. So this is the continued damage that's happening to downtown Trenton because of these laws and regulations. So some of it is highway interchanges and the construction of Route 1. Some of it is surface parking, other interchanges, and then the construction of public housing. So this is what was proposed. This was considered to be cutting edge planning and what was promoted by planners and by architects. This is the Trenton Coalport Plan, and this justified the demolition of large swaths of Black and brown and immigrant neighborhoods in North Trenton, because this is what was going to be built. It was never built. On the left is a cartoon from the early 1960s extolling white flight. Look how happy those white people are to be moving out of the city. And on the right is a cartoon from 1960 from an African-American newspaper in Baltimore, which really hits the nail on the head. What urban renewal was about was clearing out Black and brown people from cities and, in preparation for new development. Now, the problem is often the new development either never happened or took a very long time. So here is one of my early memories of living in New York was coming out of the subway. We took the subway from Brooklyn into Manhattan, coming out of the subway and being confronted with a scene like this, just sort of endless blocks of demolition. This is an early example of urban renewal, and 6 square blocks. This is this gentleman's former neighborhood, him and his family and his friends. It was a racially diverse, economically diverse, functionally diverse neighborhood, not wealthy. So it was demolished for urban renewal. Now, while this is happening in cities, what's happening in the suburbs is subsidized suburban development. Now, when Levittown was constructed, when it was completed in the 1950s in Nassau County on Long Island, it was the largest municipality with a population of about 70,000 without a single Black or brown resident. It was all white, and that was by design. And there was something called Covenant 25 that was put in place by the Levitts, which prevented any home constructed in any Levittown to be sold to a non-white person. Now, going hand in hand with this was the GI Bill. So in New York and the northern New Jersey suburbs, and this is also in the 1950s, fewer than 100 of the 67,000 mortgages that were insured by the GI Bill supported homes purchased by non-whites. Now, in Mississippi, that number, it's not as many mortgages, but the number was 2 mortgages. But it is shocking that fewer than 100 Black people could get mortgages through the GI Bill, and virtually all of these mortgages were in white suburbs. So this is suburban sprawl. This is 1950 Levittown in Nassau County. Now, in 1957, in Levittown in Pennsylvania, a family resold. Now, the covenant couldn't prevent resales to Black people, so the family sold to the Myers, an African-American family who moved into Levittown and were faced with this: weeks of protests from their white residents, and then years of harassment from their white neighbors. And this was what was being sold in the media, in magazines, and on TV. This image of the American dream. These happen to be beer advertisements, really extolling life in the suburbs. So all of this was promoting a it was denigrating life in towns and cities, promoting car culture and promoting the suburbs. And so while all of that is happening, this is what's happened to that downtown neighborhood that I showed you the aerial of from the 1920s. So the Delaware River on the right, on the left, and all of that neighborhood, that mixed neighborhood of houses and apartments and stores and small factories and restaurants and churches, all of it demolished, and synagogues, all of it demolished to make way for this kind of office park, this Le Corbusian image of what cities ought to be like. So in 1970, ongoing construction of public housing, ongoing urban renewal, demolition of Black, brown, and poor neighborhoods. White flight really takes off, and businesses must start moving to the suburbs. And in 1968, there is the race riot in response to the assassination of Martin Luther King. So many cities experienced this, and this was really pent-up frustration by Black people over their treatment in cities across the United States and reacting to the assassination. And the race riot was really used by many people, many white people, as the justification for their flight from the city. When I first moved to Trenton, people were still talking about the race riots. But all of this is the impact on downtown Trenton. So complete demolition of these historic, some of the oldest neighborhoods in Trenton, and replacement with parking lots and suburban style office buildings, the complete separation of the city from its waterfront, demolition of neighborhoods for public housing, all of that. So this is the construction of Route 29. So what cities in the United States experienced was either they had highways that separated them from their waterfronts, demolished historic neighborhoods along the waterfront and put up this barrier, or the interstate highway system went right smack through the city, demolishing historic, typically Black and brown neighborhoods and dividing the city and creating a huge scar right through the city, or both. Like, cities like Boston had both, or New York had both. Very typical low-rise public housing. This is Donnelly Homes in Trenton. And this is how the riots were presented in the media. So 1979, now there's major construction of suburban malls and subdivisions, which are really subsidized by our highway system and subsidized by construction of utilities on green fields. Ongoing population decline, loss of business and industry, and redlining actually continues into the 1970s, if not by law, by fact. And it's not until the 1968 Fair Housing Act and the 1977 Community Reinvestment Act that there's actually some laws with some teeth to counteract redlining. Now, there are plenty of other hurdles in the way of redevelopment in cities. So ongoing surface parking, ongoing destruction of historic neighborhoods continues. And 1976, the bicentennial was used as an excuse or an opportunity to demolish more historic neighborhoods and create. I mean, it's lovely that I have Mill Hill Park within walking distance. On the other hand, to create this park where the Second Battle of Trenton happened, some beautiful buildings, historic buildings were demolished. And so here is the waterfront in the 1970s in Trenton, completely separated from the Delaware River and these just enormous oceans of parking. So as a little reminder, 1931, the dense development in Trenton, and 1995. Even into the 1990s, ongoing demolition, ongoing creation of surface parking. So this is a depiction of the extent of the demolition that was typical in American downtowns, in American cities, and our historic towns. So how did we get here? The Great Migration changed the demographics of northern cities, and it spurred racist backlash. Anti-urban and racist policies were implemented. Anti-urban and racist marketing promoted suburban development and the car culture. Poor and Black neighborhoods were demolished and then replaced with public housing, surface parking, sites for, quote, surface for future redevelopment or for interstate highways. Racist attitudes and resulting policies concentrated poverty and promoted and subsidized segregated suburban development. And to add insult to injury, the decline of the American city has been typically and historically blamed on Black and brown people. And it's clearly not accurate. Specific racist policies and programs purposefully implemented by white people promoted suburban development and destroyed large swaths of our cities. And this didn't stop in the 1970s or the 1980s or even the 1990s. In 2011, Governor Christie overnight eliminated $35 million in what's been known as state aid to the city of Trenton as a distressed city, forcing dramatic layoffs and a sharp increase in property taxes. And it was really, there was a flimsy excuse for clawing back this aid, but it created, financial disaster in the city. And it's really, it's really even worse than that, because the state of New Jersey is the largest property owner in Trenton, and it pays no taxes to support its use of services. So it's always characterized the money that it pays to the city of Trenton as aid, but really it should be paying taxes to the city. And like many cities across New Jersey and many cities around the country, there is a huge amount of publicly or not-for-profit owned property in the city, which pays no property taxes. So this creates a huge financial burden. And because so much of our government services in the state of New Jersey are paid by property taxes, it is an impossible situation in Trenton, and it's an impossible situation in our other historic towns and cities. So, in terms of our built environment, what has this structural racism cost us? As a society, we all have traded away sustainable, walkable, vibrant, diverse towns and cities that have real neighborhoods, where you know your neighbors and see new, interesting, and different people every day, where you can walk to stores, restaurants, work, and to cultural institutions. We've traded all of that away. We've traded this away. We've traded this away. We've traded this away. And what we've gained is we have suburban sprawl with segregated neighborhoods, the obligatory use of cars, anonymity, and boredom. It is a very typical complaint that suburban neighborhoods are boring. We have created the ugliest and least sustainable built environment on the planet. And especially, and compared to our peer countries, the other first world countries, our development pattern is the least sustainable, uses by far the most energy. So this is what we've gotten: suburban sprawl, and this. And this. So all of that for 75 or 80 years felt completely natural. Like it felt like, obvious to do, that that's what progress was. And if you were, if you were interested in redeveloping cities until relatively recently, that was foolish. It was, a pipe dream. And so that's why I say when a city or culture is systemically racist, just living your life, your white life, leads to racist outcomes, leads to the built environment that we are surrounded by. And the final thought is empathy is not enough. We as a society, we as architects, we as planners have to do more. We have to do better. So with that, that is the presentation. And I am hoping that there are some questions or comments or.
Okay, let me see what we have for questions. From Andrew Thompson, president of Newark and Suburban. How do you feel about the city of East Orange in terms of its mixed development while keeping intact its low density residential fabric?
How do I feel about it? Well, I think, East Orange has been the victim of everything that I've talked about. And, has been divided by an enormous highway. So its character is, Trenton has its unique urban character and its unique history. But every city in New Jersey and every city around the country has its own unique and fascinating history. So East Orange has a very particular character. And, to the extent that it is taking advantage of that character and looking to redevelop within that framework, I think that is laudable, and what cities and what certainly Trenton has tried to do now that it's redeveloping is to keep what makes it unique, take advantage of that, and then fill in all the pieces that have been messed up. And so I think that is generally what East Orange and other, and forward-thinking cities are trying to do.
Thank you. We have a comment from Brian Parnagian. Great presentation and closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you.
From Darshana Patel, what thoughts or solutions do you have to undo what has been done?
Well, you know what? There is more to be done. So some of the most of the most blatant laws and regulations have been undone, but there is still implicit bias in the overall system. And, speaking as somebody who has worked on, as an architect, I've worked on redevelopment projects across the state and across the region. But I've also, as a partner in HX2 development, I've personally worked on on the development team, and it is extraordinarily difficult to redevelop in New Jersey's towns and cities. Now, there are some that have gotten over the hump. No, I remember. I'm old enough to remember when Jersey City was dead. And it is booming now. It has taken advantage of spillover from New York, and it's done a lot of planning things right. And Hoboken, I remember when Hoboken was dead, and it is now, it is unrecognizable. And Newark is now experiencing some of the same benefits. But there is still enormous economic disparity and enormous racial disparity, even in those cities that are redeveloping. So, the problem is, in my experience, is that some of the incentive programs that were put in place to try to even the playing field for cities, it looked like they were very generous. So on the one hand, they gave big incentives, but on the other, those incentives were very difficult to get, and were also made much less attractive by some other requirements and regulations that wouldn't have be required out in the suburbs. And it's also so these just need to be straight. It needs to be an acknowledgement that our historic towns and cities have been screwed over for the past 75 or 80 years, and the incentives need to be very clear cut and not giving on the one hand and taking away with the other. And one of the questions often comes up is about gentrification. So I am completely opposed to gentrification, which is sort of the rewhitening and the re-stratification of urban neighborhoods. What I'm in favor of is gentrification in the sense of encouraging mixed income development that brings civic life and money and into cities, and where new residents participate in the civic, cultural, and life of the city. I don't know if I answered. There's a lot still that needs to be done. So,
thank you. Our next question is from Jonathan Barron. White flight emptied the cities, but who benefited from the urban renewal and development of public housing and state office buildings?
So, I don't know if I completely know the answer to that question. So the state office buildings, the first ones were constructed by the state. And it was, I think, to make nominally, it was on the part of what was at that point sort of cutting edge planners and architects to make cities more comfortable for white people so that they would come back in. And that was a complete failure, but I think that was what the intention was. Now, there has to have been people that benefited from it. So there are, for public housing, it was the only thing that could get built in cities. So it got funded and it benefited, certainly the folks that built it. And I think there was an industry developed sort of in, for folks who could take advantage of this odd kind of financing and construction. But who really benefited from all of this was the folks building white suburbs. All of this encouraged people with money to move out of cities and purchase houses out there. So as Trenton's population was declining, the population in what used to be rural Mercer County was increasing.
Thank you, John. The next question is from Angela Harris. Often redevelopment displaces Black and brown people. How do we make redevelopment more inclusive and equitable?
Well, that's certainly been the case in places like New York. I'm originally from Brooklyn, and I hadn't been back to Brooklyn for a long time. And when I went back in, I don't know when it was, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, neighborhoods that I'd never heard of, or that were poor and Black, had been completely transformed and in shocking ways. So in the ways that you're talking about, and that I would refer, that it was rewhiting these neighborhoods and stratifying them economically. And that is completely problematic. And in New York, the problem is economic, that you can make so much money from that redevelopment that it's very difficult to control. And the city has tried to control it and tried to make sure that there are mixed income developments, but haven't done a good enough job. Now, in places like Trenton and Newark and Patterson and other cities that are either redeveloping, poised for redevelopment, there is a lot of fair room for redevelopment. So in Trenton, the peak population was 130,000 plus, and it's 85,000. That is a lot of people that can move into the city without displacing anyone. And all of the developments that I've worked on in Trenton, not a single person has been displaced. It's always been in vacant properties. It's always been in vacant properties. These are vacant houses or in vacant industrial properties. And the folks that have moved in, it has been very racially mixed, ethnically mixed, age mixed, economically, all of that has been very mixed. Some of it is because we have income restricted units. Partly also it's just, it's a great deal, and the folks that are choosing to live in cities are, in a place like Trenton, are those kind of people. As a city redevelops, I think you have to take very proactive steps to make sure that the city has got to get middle income and upper income housing constructed. It must be mixed income. But as that is developing, you must make sure that high quality, good housing is also being built for low and moderate income families, and that you're working with the institutions to provide opportunities for all of the people that are staying in Trenton and for lower income people that are moving into the city. There's no simple answer. It is hard work, and you have to do it as you go along.
Thank you. The next question is from Christopher Doherty. I've done work in Trenton with the Economic Development Department in the past. How do you feel about the city agencies and their approach to the current urban issues?
So the city has gone through sort of wide swings of competence, depending on the administration and what's going on and financial issues. So there have been times when it has been when there have been very forward-thinking folks in working in City Hall, and who've really pushed, I think, good planning and encouraged good development. There have been other times when it's either because of financial reasons or because of who has been in the administration, when it hasn't been so easy. Now, what's happened in the city right now is that there was a period, partly because of, actually largely because of Governor Christie's slash in state aid, a huge number of people with institutional memory and expertise were laid off at the city. And the current administration is trying to rebuild that expertise. And I think they've come a long way, but it's not there yet. COVID-19 certainly has not helped. My personal experience is, I've lived and worked in this city for a long time. I am committed to the city. I love the city, and I'm going to make it work. I'm going to figure out how to make it work so we can get, so that we can get our projects done. But for folks who think that it ought to be very easy and they ought to be welcomed with a red carpet, if that's what you're expecting, it's a little bit harder work, and you got to do a little bit of it takes a little bit of time, especially as the city is rebuilding its capacity.
Thank you. Paul Dalto says, great presentation, John. What city is a good model for proper regentrification?
Oh, that's an interesting point. I don't think I know the answer to that. I'm going to look that up, and I'm going to come up with the answer. I'm going to start by saying that my impression of the redevelopment that happening in Newark is that it is a good mix. So I'll start with that, but I need to do some research. That is a great question.
Thank you for challenging our speaker, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
Kurt Kalapski, Are mixed-use projects like Bell Works and ON3 a step in the right direction, or the same old, same old?
Oh, I think they're a step in the right direction. As somebody who, as a developer of a major mixed-use project in Trenton, Roebling Lofts and Roebling Center, I mean, that's why we're doing it, to um, is to bring that mix of uses into the city. So Bell Lofts, now ON3 is, I forget what that stands for. Anyway, Bell Lofts and that whole large development there is very close to downtown. That's all vacant buildings, vacant lots, and the mix of units and the mix, of with workplaces and with retail, I think is the right mix for downtown Trenton, and will, when it really gets going, is going to have a great beneficial impact. Just getting more people downtown and more activity. And our project, which is, when it's done, in Roebling Lofts was the first phase, which is done. That's 138 units. We have something like 230 units total, 120,000 square feet of office space, or more, 130 or 140, 35 or 40,000 square feet of retail and restaurant. So the idea is that it is a part of the fabric of that part of the city, but adds to it and encourages additional redevelopment and spinoff around it. So I think they're a big plus.
Andrew Thompson asks, you mentioned ugly buildings, AKA the projects. As architects move forward in designing proper sustainable buildings, how can we remember to never repeat these mistakes and even adopt a code of ethics to do proper design?
Well, there's ugly and there's unsustainable. I don't know if I called the public housing necessarily ugly, although a lot of it is ugly, and especially the towers. They weren't just ugly; they were inhuman. So, but I actually find suburban sprawl to be significantly uglier, and more enraging, that just the amount of space that is used up, the amount of open land, of land that should be a resource for all of us, that has been destroyed by suburban development, I find far more enraging. Now, architects and planners, we have historically been complicit in this. We've gone along with all of this. I mean, granted, it was very hard to see the big picture when this was all happening, but we've been complicit, and developers have certainly been complicit, and they take the path of least resistance. So I don't know, a code of ethics or something like that, or a code of design, it would be interesting to write it, how you could write it so that it encourages us to do the right thing. Go for it. I'd love to read it.
From Brian Parnassian, what role would you see urban planning and development playing in the current national discussions around reparations?
Oh, interesting. Well, it's interesting how I have over time come to believe that some form of reparations are necessary. So well-designed, effective reparations. And I think redeveloping cities, I think cities have been mistreated and are in such poor condition because of how we treat Black and brown people. So, in a sense, cities need, it's what I was talking about before. We need to be put on, cities need to be on an even playing field. They have been, like I said before, screwed over for 80 plus years. And to re-encourage sustainable, walkable development, we need to have clear-cut incentives that even the playing field, acknowledge how poorly towns and cities have been treated for so long, and don't give with one hand and take away with the other. So I think it's very analogous.
Thank you. From Anna Chang, I've personally heard that foreign students who mostly attend New York City schools, large amount of Asian, moved into Jersey City, actually changed the local environment and real estate market. Which one has more possibility? Shall we first bring people back to the area to trigger the change of development, or shall architecture, urban development make changes to bring them back in?
Yes. I think it's both at the same time. Yeah, yeah, honestly, that's what I think.
Thank you. From Jonathan Barron, what's happening in Trenton now? Is there anything we can be hopeful for?
Yes. So, we have an enthusiastic mayor, a tough political situation in the city, but an enthusiastic mayor. We have a number of major redevelopment projects happening, some that I'm personally involved with both as architect and as developer. So Roebling Center and Roebling Loft. So I hope you check it out. We'll have a nice announcement about that hopefully in the next few days, and that's sort of a next step. But there are other ones that are poised to happen. And the main thing about our historic towns and cities is how incredibly resilient they are. It is just considering how all the hurdles that we as a society have put in place for cities, for historic towns, for Black and brown people, for immigrants. It is just, I'm just amazed and just so gratified by how resilient cities are and the people who live in them, and how much folks in Trenton and in other towns and cities care about the city, how hard they work for it. And that's what I really find heartening. I had a couple of sort of other slides, epilogue or whatever, afterward slides, just to show some of the stuff happening in Trenton. Because I live here because I love living in the city. I love my neighborhood, but I love the diversity of the city. I love being able to walk places. So that's what I find most heartening. And there's a lot of stuff in the works.
Thank you. From John Alford, if you are working with the developer, how difficult is it to get them to buy into doing a mixed use development?
Well, there are some developers who that's what they are interested in. So, and I think over time, as we, as a profession and as allied professions talk more and more about the benefits of mixed use and walkability and sustainable environment and smart growth and smart neighborhoods and all of that, as we continue to promote all those ideas, I think there will be more and more developers who are interested in that. And now there are developers who, they have their system. I mean, they have always done things a certain way. This is what works. This is what they want to do. So I think it's difficult to convince them to do otherwise. Now, New Jersey is coming to the point where doing typical suburban sprawl development is getting more and more difficult, because there's already so much sprawl in place and there's so little space left to sprawl in. So many developers are almost forced to move into mixed use, urban, walkable development. That's a mixed blessing. I'm hoping over time that they do it because that's what makes sense. That's what they want to do, and because it's the right thing to do. and because it makes money. So anyway.
From Barry Chiarello. John,
Hey,
what
Barry.
about Lowell, Massachusetts as an example of good city redevelopment?
So I haven't been to Lowell in a while. So I love it from a historic, when I was there 10 years ago or more, I loved it from a historic preservation point of view and the reuse of those incredible mill buildings. The town at that time, the city at that time still felt a bit dead to me, and I couldn't tell how vibrant the redevelopment was. Now, but I'm going to look at it more, and I've heard, from folks who've been there more recently, like really glowing things about the city. So I think that is going to be one of the cities that I look at to see if that's a really good model.
And our next question is from an anonymous attendee. After fighting sprawl and unsustainable development for decades, how do we now deal with the forces of globalism and what in New Jersey appears to be a new generation of sprawl, largely fueled by home purchases from immigrants from Asia?
I don't, I don't know if there's anything particular to do about that. Suburban sprawl is suburban sprawl. I think what we want to do is, as a profession, and as people who care about the built environment, is to continuously promote the benefits of compact, walkable, smart growth, the benefits of living in diverse neighborhoods and diverse towns and diverse cities, and continuously promote that. There are people who are not going to buy it, but I think that's what there is for us to do.
And from Charles Chichester, any hope of reclaiming the waterfront?
Yeah, so in Trenton, so extraordinary things have been done in other towns and cities, like Boston. The Big Dig is just incredible that happened. So if that much larger projects like that can happen, I've got to think that is possible in Trenton and in other cities in New Jersey. Now, so there is a plan that has been adopted in the city to turn the Route 29 into a boulevard and to reopen a lot of that frozen land for development, for waterfront development. And there are different versions of it, and it's really exciting. And there was actually some momentum for it probably 15 years ago. I just heard from the mayor that the city is applying for a big grant. I forget the name of the grant program from the federal government to move forward with that project in Trenton. I think one of the big holdups in the state of New Jersey is how backward thinking DOT is. It is just shocking to me how irrelevant they find pedestrians and human beings that not in cars in general. There are a couple of minor projects in Trenton that we've been working on that are pedestrian friendly, that are minor changes, either low cost or no cost to some DOT infrastructure, and they have just completely. The answer is just a big FU. So anyway, it's just shocking to me how backward DOT is. But there is hope. I think it's exciting what could happen with the waterfront in Trenton and in other cities across New Jersey that have been similarly marred.
John, that was our last question, and we are over time for tonight's presentation. I want to thank you very much for sharing your experience and vision with us. Obviously, it was of great interest to our audience, and we had a very robust question and answer period. To everyone who's on the call, we will be posting the recording of this on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks, and the premiere will be announced through social media and the newsletter. Tomorrow, you'll be receiving a survey that you need to complete and send back to AIA New Jersey in order to close the loop on you getting your continuing education credits. Tonight's program is worth one Health, Safety, and Welfare LU. So thank you everyone for participating. John, thank you so much for just a really wonderful presentation. And I think it's really going to have people thinking and talking, and I'm sure the conversation will continue.
Great. Thank you all.
Have a good night, everyone. Good night. Be safe.
Good night.